I got seas going right across my deck here now. I did not run up in his vicinity, but no, I didn't. So this is just Roger. Thanks for that information, sir, and I'll get back to you if we come up with anything. Over.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Beyond the Breakers, a podcast about shipwrecks, loss, and lessons learned from maritime disasters. My name's Tanner. I am here with Taylor, but before we go any further, we have 4 new patrons to thank. We would like to say thank you to Amy, Mac, Peter, and Christian. So thank you so much for supporting us over on Patreon. If you're not with us over on Patreon, we like to get a bit more adventurous over there. We don't always talk about specifically a shipwreck. It may be something more ship related. We might watch a movie. Most recently, we watched the 1976 movie Midway, and we discussed a little bit of the history behind that. Check it out if you want a little bit more of the podcast each month. So with that, let's bring in Taylor. Taylor, how's it going?
Oh, not too bad. It was like warm here today, like 85, 87, but it wasn't humid, so really like not bad. It's so dry though. Are you guys having that same issue currently?
It's been fairly humid here.
Has it?
We were in Michigan over the last few days. We were at a wedding, so a bit chillier over on that side. Since it was fairly warm when we left here, I didn't bring any hoodies or jackets or anything.
Mm-hmm.
We decided we were going to take the Badger ferry back on the return leg, and I was like, oh, I should probably grab a hoodie before that, because it'll probably get chilly out on the water.
Did you get a SS Badger hoodie?
Well, I did buy one on the ferry, but before that, I had just gone to Meijer and grabbed a hoodie. I was going to try and grab, Meijer usually has like local sports stuff, so I was going to try and grab like a Western Michigan hoodie or something. Mm-hmm. I'd wear Broncos gear, but all they had was Spartans and Wolverines, so I passed on that.
Disappointing. Our Meijer even has local high schools and stuff.
Yeah,
I think random local high school.
I think a lot of those have that. But anyway, yes, we took the Badger back home. It was a lot of fun. I had not done that since, being very, very little. We did that once when we were kids. It was cool. It was an experience. Obviously, you do that not for the, not because it's fast and efficient, but it is a fun experience crossing the lake like that, rather than driving back down, going through Chicago and all that stuff that we've done a million times. It was cool to do it that way. It is expensive. I mean, you are paying for the experience, but
how much did that run you?
I think with a car and 2 adults, I think it ended up coming out to like $250, $300, something like that.
Okay, yeah, that is a little bit, but
it was fun. It was a cool way to do that. What have you been up to?
Last night I went to a $5 mystery movie at the local theater. And it's a movie that's like releasing soon, but you get to see it before it officially releases. You just don't know what it is like until the movie starts. So it's kind of fun. It turned out to be My Old Ass, starring Aubrey Plaza and Maisie Estella. It was good. I actually had seen some sort of trailer for it, maybe on TikTok or something Aubrey Plaza was promoting. Definitely kind of gave me like Juno vibes, that kind of thing. It was good. It's probably not something I would have normally seen in a theater, but it was worth $5. It was also fun to see Aubrey Plaza play kind of, I guess, what you'd call a motherly role, but it was cool seeing her kind of be presented as like the adult in the situation. So yeah, that was fun. It was fun speculating on like what movie it was going to be and everything. It was unfortunately not Gladiator 2. So other than that, let's see here. I finished Hitler's People by Richard J. Evans. It was an excellent book for as heavy of a topic as it is. I found it really to be like a really easy read, if you know what I mean. Like, it's well organized. It's put together in a way that makes sense. It went by very quickly.
I've heard great things about it from everything. I've seen a bunch of people tweeting about it.
He does a good job of sort of poking at both sides of the extremes when it comes to Nazis, that on one side they were all like genocidal maniacs, and on the other, well, no one knew what was really going on. He's like, it's a mix. Like, it's not that simple. You can't just lump it all together. So it's really good. I enjoyed that so much I figured I'd stay in Germany with my next book. I started the Weimar years, Rise and Fall, from 1918 to 1933 by Frank McDonough. A lot of it's funny because a lot of the names in 1918 in German politics don't mean very much. But as we march through the years, I'm recognizing more and more names.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll be interesting to see after reading about a lot of the individual people, how kind of what roles they're playing in this as I go through it. So it's not the lightest read, but it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I could see that having its dense moments. I feel like anything with German history is going to have those.
It definitely does, and then it all is kind of like, and then they were all executed, and you know what I mean? It's and forget about those people; they don't matter anymore.
I am getting closer to finishing Twilight of the Gods, the Ian Soul Pacific trilogy. The last one in those. I just finished Iwo Jima, just kicking off Okinawa.
You sound like a Marine writing home to their mother.
But I'm also reading, I started reading a book by Craig Werner called A Change is Gonna Come, Music, Race, and the Soul of America.
That sounds interesting.
Yeah, it's an overview of popular Black music and musicians in American history and kind of how those styles of music play into broader American culture and American history. And because it's specifically focused on popular music, it starts out in the 60s. Obviously, there's a huge history of Black music for decades before that in America, with like the really early like blues and jazz. But because it is the emphasis being on things that started to get into the mainstream, so it starts out in the 60s. Section 1 is titled A Change is Gonna Come, Mahalia Jackson, Motown, and the Movement. And I've just started it out, but it's very good. I like the way he writes about music and writes about culture. And he kind of starts there because it's the sense that you have Mahalia Jackson being his prime example, but you have, Black artists, for example, gospel artists who are making a name for themselves and becoming known not just in Black America, but in white America, in quote unquote mainstream America, but not by adopting the, white cultural musical norms, by presenting the music that they want to present, Mahalia Jackson sticking with her gospel rather than, going mainstream, as it were. I don't necessarily listen to a lot of that older type stuff, but getting into how it links into more modern music. The book was originally published in 1988, but the version I have is revised and republished from 2006, which is nice because that lets it include that, huge explosion in the 90s of, rap and hip hop and how that sort of started to take over as the mainstream popular music. I mean, now any sort of pop music on the radio is far more influenced by hip hop than it is by, rock and roll. Oh, the other cool thing about Craig Werner is that he is a professor at Wisconsin, at Madison.
Go Badgers. In
the Department of African American Studies. He's now a professor emeritus, but he's also on the nominating committee for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Interesting.
And I think his background, at least from what I've seen so far in his writing, I think he is much more into more of the jazz blues type stuff personally, but he sort of uses that to write about kind of this cultural space as a whole. So I'm really enjoying it. I'm having to read about a lot of stuff I don't really know that much about. So when he's writing about, he'll be writing about something from jazz and how, these different phrases talk to each other and what they're trying to say. And it's not something I've ever really listened for in jazz, intentionally. So it's a cool way to read and think about music, though.
I remember I took like music 101 from one of my gen eds in college. And as part of that, you had to pick one of 3 specialties to learn about in American music. And your options were rock and roll, which is like the one most people did. There was blues, which a few people did. And then there was jazz. And boy, did I think I was cool that me, the business major, was going to go in there and do the jazz one because I know music. I got an A in that class, but I spent so much time working on an elective. Like that was the hardest class I had that year, was this jazz, like subset of my music class.
Well, I do a presentation with my level 3 students where they have to present about a genre of music, and I usually restrict it to genres of music that they probably won't know as much about. So like I don't want them to do a presentation about K-pop because like that's what they hear and they listen to all the time, or like just general pop music. And so it's usually give them options, but it's usually stuff like bluegrass or reggae or even like country music. Obviously, that's a huge genre here, but it's not as well known in Korea, in China, in Japan. Even like classic rock and roll, something like that. And it's always funny whenever someone presents about rap or hip hop. A lot of my students are really, really interested in hip hop, modern hip hop, but also a lot of them are interested in 90s hip hop. So it's really, really cool when we talk about that to get to show them those connections between so much of hip hop and rap is samples of older stuff. And, this is a sample from this gospel song, or this is a sample from this Parliament song, or whatever it may be. And it's really cool to see them like make those connections. So yeah, like this book as a whole, I think is really cool for furthering that interest.
Are you like subtly trying to convert a couple of them over to metal each time?
One of them did present about metal last time. And so one of the things they look at is like subgenres. And so metal's a great genre to do that with, because there's some fairly, not always clean cut, but there's some fairly noticeable like distinctions between like death metal and black metal and doom metal, and then each of them having sub genres. But it is fun to do that with students, especially when it is a genre that they don't listen to, and they can kind of look at it almost more academically and separating it out into like a taxonomy.
Cool.
All right. We have some music to deal with also here, and that is the sweet music of the steamboat whistle.
Every time the Reds hit a home run, that's what you hear.
The one time Katie and I went to, I think it was Star Wars night, we went to a Reds game. They were playing the Giants. I'm pretty sure Tim Lincecum was pitching, if the time works out.
That sounds about right.
Oh no, it wasn't Tim Lincecum. It was who's the guy from Hickory?
Madison Bumgarner.
Madison Bumgarner, so I'm thinking of. But anyway, the Reds hit a home run, and the smokestack like caught on fire. I think one of the like the fireworks malfunctioned. So we're going to talk about a steamboat today. I love talking about steamboats. I think they're really, really cool. So I always like doing a steamboat story. This is another riverboat accident. We've covered quite a few steamboats, riverboats, but those stories tend to end with a boiler explosion and or fire.
Yeah.
This will be different.
Okay.
In our episode on the steamboat Moselle that suffered a catastrophic boiler explosion at Cincinnati in 1838, that's one of my favorite episodes I think that we've done.
That was a good episode.
That's episode 93. If you want to pause and revisit that, because it might help review some of that material. The Moselle was neither the first nor the last horrible steamboat disaster, but it was the one that prompted the federal government to step in and regulate transportation in the United States for the first time, rather than leaving that up to individual states. The main source I'm going to be using here, most of the quotations will come from an article called The Scioto Disaster by Kenneth R. Bailey.
By the 1820s, several states, concerned by the lack of oversight of boiler and boat constructions, passed laws designed to protect passengers by inspecting and otherwise controlling steamboats in their waters. Fearing a patchwork of conflicting rules and regulations, and after much opposition to government regulation, Congress gave the federal government authority to inspect steamboats and later to license pilots and captains, possibly the first instance of federal intervention in private enterprise.
And that was a lot of our discussion with the Moselle, was the idea that this was so alien at the time that the government would even step in to control something like this, and how invasive that felt to some of these business people who were used to just doing whatever they wanted.
Well, and that gets especially weird with things like transportation, especially on a river, because then it's like, well, did this accident happen in Ohio or did it happen in Kentucky? Like, someone might want to be in one of those courts because it might be better for them. Can you imagine if airplanes worked on that principle of like state by state regulation?
So as we mentioned there, one of the results of the initial federal intervention was this requirement of routine inspections of vessels wholly or partially powered by steam. In the Moselle episode, we went into a lot more depth in the development of those further laws that ultimately resulted in the reduction of steamboat accidents, although that wasn't always a smooth and linear improvement. It did get worse before it got better. Through the 1830s and 40s, despite that act of 1838, steamboat accidents actually did increase in quantity and also, in some ways, in severity. In August of 1852, the Steamboat Act was passed. This required all boilers to undergo hydrostatic testing, and it made the boiler safety valve a mandatory piece of equipment. Now, what you do with that safety valve is kind of up to you as the engineer on this boat, as the captain. They were not always used properly. We talked about how those could be tampered with to try and get a little extra steam out of the boilers, and also usually ended up exploding the boiler and killing a lot of people.
Do you think there was like some asshole boilermaker back in the day who's like, no, this is a special titanium boiler. Like, it's fine. Aluminum. Like, it you don't need to worry about it. It's good. Aircraft grade.
So that 1852 act did, however, leave a large number of steam vessels exempt from these requirements. Things like ferries, tugs, a lot of the vessels that were traveling the rivers were actually exempt because they weren't strictly passenger vessels.
This is like the classic, like, we're doing something, like, kind of law.
Yeah, like, and doing it like for the most visible ones. Obviously, if a passenger boat explodes, it's going to probably kill the most people. So we want to fix that, but the others do it at your own risk. So these accidents remained relatively common. Finally, in 1871, another act of Congress was passed to hopefully plug the holes left by the 1838 and 1852 laws. The most impactful result of this act was the creation of the Steamboat Inspection Service, which would now provide federal oversight to vessel inspection and the licensing of masters and mates.
Do you know how cool it would be to like have a badge that says that?
SIS badge?
It had to have existed or something like it, and I want it.
Presumably they had some sort of way of, identifying themselves. Like a little, instead of like a sheriff's star, it's like a paddle wheel. We're actually going to talk about how much power the SIS actually had, which is not that much, actually.
It's not like the post office police.
It's not like the post office police or like the DNR police or anything like that. It's
the kind of cops that like you're screwed as soon as you like see them, that they know who you are.
So we're going to now jump ahead to the 1880s, where we will find our main character, the side wheel steamer Scioto, plying the upper waters of the Ohio River.
I know that place.
Providing passenger service to towns along the Ohio and West Virginia riverfront. Also, a spelling note, Scioto is spelled Scioto. It's the same as like the river that runs through Columbus, Ohio, and through most of the state of Ohio.
I swear, like, you cross that thing 8 times on 35, going like towards West Virginia and stuff.
It doesn't really look how it sounds, so that is the name of our vessel here today. She would run a few different routes just up and down the river, up and down the Ohio, that is, with some of her most frequent stops being Parkersburg, Marietta, Matamoras, Sistersville, Moundsville, Wheeling, Wellsburg, Wellsville, and East Liverpool.
Do you think Wellsburg and Wellsville just hate each other?
Well, especially because one is in Ohio and one is in West Virginia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So in July of 1881, the Scioto was laid up for a general overhaul in Wheeling, West Virginia. I was able to find some earlier reference to her in the newspaper database, but since she's getting this big overhaul, I figured this is a great place to start because this is the ship as she will be in our story.
Okay.
This was a pretty serious amount of work she was having done. This would continue from July into October of 1881. Aside from that Kenneth Bailey article, the two other main sources of stuff that I was able to find are from the dueling newspapers of the Wheeling Daily Register and the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, who are both putting stuff out pretty much concurrently for all of the things that I'm going to be talking about.
I'm assuming that essentially what this boils down to is one paper is pro-Klan and one paper is anti-Klan.
Well, being in West Virginia, especially in Wheeling, they're both probably pretty anti-slavery.
That's true. That's true.
One of them I know for sure is. So the Wheeling Daily Register had this to say about the Scioto's overhaul in the October 20th, 1881 edition of the paper, in an article titled, "A Nearly New Steamboat."
The steamboat Scioto, which has been repaired at the wharf in this city, is a perfect model of beauty, grace, and elegance, having been completely overhauled and repaired. To meet the demands of the traveling public, the firebox tubular boilers that were aboard were taken off and a pair of steel boilers, double riveted, 42 inches in diameter, 24 feet long, with 6 8-inch lap-welded flues put aboard in their place.
Her cabin work, graining and painting, is the work of Mr. George Gray of the island, and he may well be proud of it, as it lends a charm to the appearance and comfort of this little daisy, rarely, if ever, found on board a packet. He's done a tip-top job of walnut graining on the office, and the recesses in the ladies' and gentlemen's cabins are ash, while the columns for the gentleman's cabin, forward to the ladies' cabin aft, are mahoganized.
The ceilings, skylights, and panel bulkheads are finished in white and varnished, showing as a thing of beauty and is a joy forever. The lettering and decorating was under the care of Mr. Sobes of Moundsville, and he need not feel ashamed of his work.
Also, in that quote where it says Mr. George Gray of the island, it's referring to Wheeling Island, which is, as it sounds, a island that is just right by Wheeling, West Virginia.
I like how descriptive this article was, even of the tubular boilers that were removed and the double riveted 42-inch, 24-foot long. Yeah, they're very, very detail focused.
And there you can see some of the technological advancements since we talked about the Moselle. A lot of those we were talking about iron and copper boilers, and here she's got these 2 steel boilers. So we can see things progressing. So this article concludes with a summary of the Scioto's measurements. She's 150 feet long, 22.5 feet in beam, with a 4.5-foot depth of hold. She would resume her route between Sistersville and Wheeling, which is about 100 miles on the river, with an expected cruising speed of 12 miles per hour. Because she's running these regular routes over a pretty contained stretch of river, she appears frequently in the local newspapers, particularly in the Wheeling Daily Register and the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer. And she usually appears alongside the same set of other riverboats, so these are all kind of characters in the play. Vessels like Acorn, Belle Prince, C.W. Bachelor, Little Anna, Diurnal, Katie Stockdale, Andes, and my favorite, Iron Duke.
Iron Duke.
They're all such cool names. I like Diurnal and Iron Duke a lot.
Yeah, I like those too. That is funny that they kind of become characters.
So this stretch that she's running is it's about 100 miles, a little over 100 miles that she's covering here. The furthest point down the river that I saw her mentioned at was Point Pleasant, which is about 200 miles from East Liverpool.
It's where the Mothman lives.
Yes. But she spends most of her time kind of in this relatively small stretch of the Ohio. For some time, Scioto was under a Captain Dillon, who seems to have been pretty well liked. But sometime around March 1882, she came under new ownership by the Wheeling and Parkersburg Transportation Company. Later, Cincinnati is going to be added into that name. But as noted in the March 21st, 1882 edition of the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, the captain and crew of another riverboat, Welcome, were transferred to the Scioto. The new captain was Thaddeus Thomas, and he'll be a character in our story today.
Thaddeus Thomas is one of those names that could have been in the Revolution. It could have been a steamboat captain. Could have been a middle linebacker for the Ravens in the early 2000s. Like, it could go anywhere.
It's a solid name. Thaddeus Thomas, named after 2 apostles. Scioto is mentioned in the Intelligencer again about a week later on March 29th.
The Scioto was away behind time yesterday, having an immense trip, both as regards passengers and freight.
So I can't confirm this. I didn't see this anywhere, but I do find the timing interesting. That in one edition of the paper, they mention that she has new ownership. And the next time that she's mentioned in the paper, it talks about how much she's carrying, how many passengers, how much cargo she's carrying.
Is there a little pressure to report that? Or do you think a different attitude as far as operations?
And I don't know who owned her before. So I don't know if maybe it was more of a small scale endeavor before, and maybe now she's part of a bigger business and she's having these greater demands placed on her. But I just think the timing's interesting. Maybe she is expected to carry, maybe over her capacity now that she's under this new ownership. In April, the Intelligencer had this to say about the Scioto and her new captain.
We miss the familiar face of Captain Dillon on the Scioto, but see the genial countenance of Captain Thomas in command. A kinder man never trod a steamboat deck, and we will travel with him all the same. I don't feel like kindness is a descriptor of a steamboat captain very often.
It isn't, and it would almost be weird if you're like, oh, is he, like, what do you think about this steamboat captain? It's like, he's kind.
Mm-hmm.
It's like almost a backhanded compliment for a steamboat captain.
It's almost like a euphemism or something.
But at the same time, like, this is late 1800s, and this is still, this is the Upper Ohio, so this isn't the rough and tumble frontier days. So it's probably a slightly different breed of captain than you might have at the same place 50 years before.
True.
Maybe you can be a bit more of a gentleman in these situations. Among all the shipping news in these papers, you also get a glimpse into the racing culture that still existed on the river at this time. So racing had plagued the steamboat industry in the 19th century. Pretty much every steamboat boiler explosion, you can find some sort of allegation where they seem to have been racing against another vessel. This was a pretty big problem, trying to control these captains, these pilots racing against one another. And so this had been linked to several incidents due to overtaxing of the boilers and or collisions with other vessels. By this point, it seems to have continued on in a slightly less intense form. Literally, laws had been passed against this, so you probably had to be more careful. Here from the Daily Register on February 27th, 1882.
A dispatch was received here Saturday evening from Captain Asa Booth of the Diurnal, saying that his boat passed the Scioto in a fair race. In an interview with Captain Dillon of the Scioto, he stated that he passed the Diurnal underway below Newport, and in a distance of about 3 miles, led her 3/4 of a mile. The captain invites the commander of the Diurnal to try their speed again, and says the journal's report, which stated the Diurnal took the cake, should have read took the bank.
Here from the Daily Intelligencer on April 29th, 1882.
The Scioto and the Diurnal had a lively race on last Monday evening. The Diurnal left 1/2 mile ahead, but the Scioto overtook and passed her before she got to Sardis.
Right. So, the 2 small examples. You can find other boats being mentioned. But what's cool is that you do often see these little rivalries develop between boats. You often see the same 2 boats racing each other, kind of paired off. Here you've got the Scioto and the Diurnal. Later we'll see another pair that might be important in our story here.
It's funny how it's like they're your Pokemon rival. Like you just challenge each other like every time you see each other.
Yeah, exactly. And so in May of 1882, the Scioto underwent some fairly routine repairs and received a new paint job until she was, quote, perfect as a daisy, in the words of the Daily Intelligencer. And in the June 29th edition of the Daily Intelligencer, we have the following update regarding our main character.
What is that word supposed to be? Is it exskirt?
Exskirt? Like the verb of excursion? I've never seen that before. And Word does not recognize it as a word, so.
No. The well. I don't know why exskirt is so funny. The Wellsville Band will exskirt to Moundsville on the steamer Scioto on July 4th.
All right, so a couple interesting things here. First of all, yes, we have the verb exskirt, which is, I think, just like a back formation from the noun excursion. I've never seen the verb exskirt before. I think it's funny because it sounds like squirt, and you want to say exskirt.
Yeah, that is a fun one.
But we have this band from Wellsville, like a marching band type thing. I think it's technically called a coronet band. So they are going to book the steamer Scioto for July 4th as part of their July 4th celebration. And this brings us to the date of our incident, July 4th, 1882.
Okay.
At 6:30 a.m. that morning, the steamer Scioto, captained by Thaddeus Thomas, had departed East Liverpool, Ohio, bound for Moundsville, West Virginia. with an estimated 250 people on board. There's no passenger manifest, nor was one required at the time.
Why would there have been?
East Liverpool, Ohio is located on a bend in the Ohio River just a couple miles west of the Pennsylvania border. So it's sort of between Pittsburgh and Canton, for people familiar with that area of the country. Pittsburgh and Akron, you could say, maybe.
This is a weird part of the Ohio River to me because I'm very familiar with Pittsburgh. I'm very familiar with Cincinnati and even Point Pleasant and Gallipolis and all that. But I forget that it goes like north.
Moundsville, West Virginia is south of Wheeling, West Virginia, which we've already mentioned a few times. Wheeling is the biggest city in that part of West Virginia that sticks up between Ohio and Pennsylvania. Wheeling's a cool place because it was the center of the anti-slavery sentiment when West Virginia broke away from the rest of the state in 1863. And it was actually West Virginia's first capital. And actually, cool thing I read about today, Wheeling was very briefly the capital of both Virginia and West Virginia at the same time.
Interesting. I did not know that.
So yes, for, I don't know, anyone who's never seen this before, if you look at a map of the U.S. before the Civil War in, like, say, 1860, obviously lots of it looks different, but Virginia looks really weird. It has, like, a tumor on it, it looks like. And that pulls off and becomes West Virginia during the Civil War.
Turns out Virginia was the tumor.
That was the cancer all along. So for all of the, I mean, people like to make fun of West Virginia, but it is a beautiful state, and it exists for one of the more pure reasons that a state could exist in the United States. So overall, this outward trip was about 50 miles south on the Ohio to celebrate Independence Day in Moundsville. And I don't know what is special about Moundsville for 4th of July, but if you go to visitmoundsville.com, like their tourism website today, this is still advertised as a place to celebrate the 4th. So I don't know. Maybe it's just a really nice views of the river. West Virginia is just a beautiful state, so being right on the river,
really is.
You probably have some cool natural scenery if you want to do, fireworks and stuff like that.
The only thing I can think of is that maybe it was somewhat of a regional, like, hub of government due to, like, the prison being there and stuff.
Well, that's why that's why they put the prison there, is because it was close enough to Wheeling, and we'll talk about the prison in a second. Just a few miles downriver from East Liverpool, the Scioto stopped to pick up additional passengers at Wellsville, Ohio. At Wellsville, it's estimated that a similar number boarded the vessel. So she already has 250 on her. She adds an additional roughly 250, putting her at around 500 passengers.
It's a lot of people
on this excursion as she's excurting down the river. So continuing downriver, Captain Thomas, he didn't intend to make any more stops. He says, we're already overfull as is. I don't want to put anyone else on this. The vessel's already ponderously overloaded. It's difficult to steer. It's so heavy. However, a few miles downriver from Wellsville, her rudder rope snapped.
Oh, that would be even more important for steering.
This was pretty quickly repaired, and they did end up stopping at Wheeling. I'm assuming just to double check that everything was working properly. It seems like a precautionary stop. It's not clear if more people got on. I would assume not. But it's possible.
It's a good ways down the river. So, I mean, if everything's looking good at this point, I would feel pretty good.
Yeah, it's like, why not? During her stop at Wheeling, we do see some further ill portents for the Scioto. Quoting here from Kenneth R. Bailey, he's going to mention the name Mulholland. That is the manager of the Wellsville Coronet Band. So he's one of the guys who organized this excursion.
Mulholland later told the Wheeling Intelligencer that he had to keep part of the crowd on the lower deck to keep the boat in trim and to prevent it from becoming top-heavy. Mulholland, who was in charge of entertainment and refreshments, was quick to add that no alcohol was served on board, only lemonade and eatables. At the stop in Wheeling, bystanders remarked on how low the boat was riding in the water. One observer saw the Scioto was underway and reported that the boat was decidedly overweight and careened to one side.
So people can tell that she's far past her limits of what she should be carrying.
I feel like when normal people are like, hey, that doesn't look right.
The Scioto reached Moundsville at 1:30 p.m. I'm assuming she was supposed to get there a little bit earlier, but with that little delay, probably added.
I'm sure there's some
time.
spacing built into these itineraries too.
I say that because they don't spend that much time at Moundsville as
Really?
it is. After part of the afternoon of celebrating and sightseeing, including a tour of the West Virginia Penitentiary.
You go and look at them like they're zoo animals.
Well, it's an active penitentiary at this time. This is like in its heyday. It's like a new penitentiary at this time. So I assume maybe to go see how cool it looks, like maybe around the grounds, around the outside. I don't know. Anyway, after that, the Scioto's passengers boarded her once again for the return trip to East Liverpool. They departed Moundsville at 3:30 p.m. So They were really only on site for about 2 hours.
Get there, vibes are off a little bit. You're like, you know what? We can go home and save the afternoon.
Time to, I don't know, have some snacks, have some coleslaw, have some sliders or something, a brat, a hot dog, see the prison.
Don't fill up, though, because there's lemonade and eatables on the way home, too.
For those curious, it does say eatables, not edibles, in the quote. So they leave Moundsville at 3:30. Quoting again here from Bailey.
The passage upstream was uneventful until the boat neared Mingo Island, 6 miles above Wellsburg on the West Virginia shore, and 3 miles south of Steubenville on the Ohio shore. The presence of the island forced boats into a more narrow passage near the Ohio shore, where the water was deepest. The John Lomas, a stern-wheeled tugboat with its own load of holiday passengers, was coming downstream. Accounts of what happened after the John Lomas saw the Scioto coming upstream vary greatly.
Fun side note here, a little sports aside. So this, what will be this collision, happens near Mingo Junction, is the closest town to it. Here's some trivia for you. In 1935 to 1936, Mingo Junction High School's football team had a certain assistant coach, a name that would later become enshrined in Ohio football history. Do you want to guess who it was?
Is it Paul Brown?
No, good guess, though.
Who is it?
He coached at Ohio State. He choked a guy.
Yeah, what's his name? I'm blanking on his name.
He choked an opposing player.
Yeah. What's his? I can picture him doing it.
Or he like punched him in the throat. I don't know if he choked him.
Yeah, I'm like picturing him doing that. What's his name?
Mr. Woody Hayes.
Woody Hayes. I can see him attacking the player.
So if you don't know that clip, you should Google it. Woody Hayes. I think it was Clemson they were playing. But anyway, fun bit of trivia about Mingo Junction. The John Lomas, they were the vessel descending the river. So based on the norms of river travel, they had the responsibility of initiating the pass, via their whistle to signal how they were going to set this up. Benjamin Jackson Long, the pilot on board the Lomas, blew his whistle once. This indicated that he wanted to keep to the Ohio shore and pass the Scioto port to port. This was the standard, normal way to pass. So one blast of the whistle would indicate, okay, we're just going to do this the normal way. After some time, it's not clear how much, but general consensus seems to be longer than usual, longer than would be expected. The Scioto's pilot, David C. Keller, issued 2 blasts from the boat's whistle. So this is the pitcher shaking off the catcher's sign, essentially saying, no, I'm going to do it the other way. This indicated that he was going to claim the Ohio shore side and that the Lomas should instead turn to pass on the West Virginia side. So now a starboard to starboard pass. Quoting here from Bailey.
As the vessels were making their turns, they collided. The John Lomas struck the Scioto on its left side just below the waterline, tearing a large hole in the bulkhead. Immediately after the crash, the John Lomas, which suffered almost no damage, backed away and headed to the Ohio shore, where it offloaded its passengers. Badly damaged, the Scioto sank with only its upper deck protruding above the water. As soon as the John Lomas could unload its passengers, it returned and began a rescue operation.
Like in many of these collisions, the collider is usually fine or suffers minor damage. is at least still in sailing condition, whereas the Calliope is usually stricken pretty hard, as it is in this case. Bailey notes that the river at this spot was about 1,082 feet wide, or about 330 meters, with the Scioto sinking about 200 feet, or 61 meters, from the Ohio shore. One family on board the Scioto was that of Thomas and Mary Garner, with their 3 children, 2 girls and 1 boy. The family was all together in their stateroom when one of the daughters, Augusta, said she was thirsty and wanted a drink of water. This is right around 8:30 p.m. Continuing on from Kenneth R. Bailey in The Scioto Disaster. Oh, and that's from the Journal of West Virginia History, is where this article comes from.
Her father took her to the main deck to get a drink when the collision occurred, sinking the Scioto in less than 60 seconds, in 15 feet of water. Thomas Garner left Augusta on deck while he tried to get to the remainder of his family. He was unable to find them, returned, and it is supposed that he and Augusta were part of a group saved by the John Lomas.
So as mentioned there, the Lomas herself, she's able to rescue a lot of passengers from the Scioto. She makes these 4 trips back and forth from the wreck. And so the time is interesting here. Given the time, 8:30 p.m. when this happens, in this part of the country, this time of the year, the sun had not fully set.
Yeah, it would still be relatively light, I imagine.
Yeah, the light would be fairly low. So, for example, I just looked this up. July 4th of this year, 2024, sunset in Wheeling, West Virginia happened at 8:55 p.m. So despite that low visibility, it's light enough where witnesses on shore can see this happen, and they're able to dispatch some small boats to pick up survivors out of the water. So it's not total darkness when this happens, which is good. The Scioto's own lifeboats were deployed, but very quickly overloaded and capsized. Some people were able to successfully swim to shore. However, for those who survived the initial collision, the safest option was just to stay put on the Scioto.
I imagine.
Because again, it's in 15 feet of water, so it's not really going to go anywhere. Sure, there might be the risk that it comes apart, it collapses, but rather than trying to swim this 200 feet to shore, probably best just staying put, especially when there are boats in the vicinity rescuing people. It's noted that many of those who chose to jump into the river likely would have survived if they had just stayed on board.
It's so interesting, like when that happens with like river disasters, because it is so tempting because you're 200 feet from shore, the water's not that deep. It's interesting drowning that close to land.
Well, there is that, and on the one hand, it does seem kind of silly. Like, why would you jump in the water at this point? And I think one of the risks that probably is in people's minds, though, with these steamboat incidents is probably fire.
Or a boiler explosion.
These things do explode. They do catch on fire. So if something has gone wrong, it's kind of always a possibility. So maybe there is the thought of, I don't want to be on this thing if it catches on fire. Quoting here again from Bailey.
One of the missing, later confirmed dead, was Dan Thomas, the son of the Scioto's captain. Thad Thomas's older son, Clinton, an aspiring pilot, survived. Reporters found Captain Thomas to be so desolate at Dan's death that it was feared he would commit suicide. Thomas was able to do nothing but weep and couldn't immediately make a statement on the tragedy.
In the immediate aftermath of the incident, the death toll is estimated at 10 to 15. This very quickly jumps up to at least 50, and then finally settles around 75, as more and more bodies are recovered from the river and from the wreckage. Like many shipwreck stories from the time, it doesn't take long for allegations of drunkenness and other misbehaviors to make a target of one or both vessels' pilots.
I feel like that's just like the immediate thing with these from this time period.
And you know what? It's right a lot of the time, so...
Some survivors from the Scioto made allegations that the pilot of the Scioto was drunk and had a woman with him in the pilot house. She, it was reported, was piloting the boat and blowing the whistle just before the collision.
So this is like that Aeroflot plane with the kids.
Where he lets the kid crash the plane.
Except we know that happened.
Yeah, that was recorded.
So we opened the episode by talking about federal oversight, and here's where we get some of that. The Steamboat Inspection Service dispatched John Fehrenbach. I keep wanting to say John Fetterman.
John Fetterman.
And so that's who I imagine in this story. They dispatched John Fehrenbach, chief inspector for the Cincinnati-Pittsburgh district, to begin his investigation. To assist him in this task, he enlisted 2 U.S. steamboat inspectors stationed at Wheeling. This is Hiram Young and Thomas Wilson, not the Thomas Wilson of Great Lakes shipping fame. He wrote to them on July 5th, saying,
"You are hereby instructed to investigate immediately and in the fullest possible and most rigid manner the collision which occurred between the steamers John Lomas and Scioto. Leave no stone unturned to get to the bottom of this terrible disaster. I have no official information and must therefore rely on Associated Press dispatches. From the information I have, however, it appears that somebody is to blame. You will therefore show no leniency nor favors, but get at the facts that the guilty parties, whoever they may be punished to the fullest extent of the law."
Israel has the right to defend itself.
Is Mr. Fetterman? No.
Chief Inspector John Fehrenbach arrived in Wheeling on July 7th and spent the next few days gathering information and issuing arrest warrants for both vessels' pilots, David Keller and Benjamin Jackson Long.
I mean, they had to have a badge if they can issue arrest warrants, right?
Well, yeah, so he does. I think he has some sort of federal power there. I think the local ones less so. And once we get into the legal aspects of it, we'll see more. A court of inquiry was convened at the Custom House in Wheeling beginning on July 11th. Here we get into some excellent names. The Lomas party, including owner Captain Levi Englebright and pilot Benjamin Long, were represented by Elbridge G. Craycraft, I.C. Gray, and Robert G. Barr. Elbridge G. Craycraft is my recording name on this session.
Those are some good names.
On the Scioto side of things, the Wheeling, Parkersburg, and Cincinnati Transportation Company is how it's listed here. Captain Thad Thomas and pilot David Keller were represented by Blackburn B. Dovener and William Pallister Hubbard. So note that this is a court of inquiry, not a trial. Although it is funny reading about it because the legal counsel on both sides keep basically trying to make it into a trial. They keep on wanting, he's like, well, we want to do our opening statement. We want to do our closing statement. We want to voir dire the witness. So they keep doing this, but it is not, in fact, a criminal trial. Bailey points out that there was a deal of misunderstanding in the public and the press over what the Steamboat Inspection Service could actually do.
The service was charged with the inspection of all of a boat's components, hulls, engines, safety equipment, and with licensing marine officers. The local inspectors, acting as a board of inquiry, could revoke licenses of marine officers, but could not refer criminal or civil penalties. If allegations of criminal misconduct were made, any evidence of such misconduct would be turned over to appropriate federal officials for prosecution. Not only were there questions of jurisdiction, but the steamboat rules and regulations were not precise, often allowing for special local circumstances which conflicted with published rules of navigation.
And that last bit really is what this story ends up coming down to. One of the elements of the story is that's really in no doubt is that the Scioto was overloaded. Mm-hmm. She's only licensed to carry 300 passengers. She was carrying as many as 500, if not more, on July 4th, 1882. So that part we can kind of skip over. There's not really much interesting there. The interesting part is in the respective boat pilots' intentions in making the head-to-head pass.
Mm-hmm.
The Scioto's pilot, David Keller, was the first to testify at the hearing.
Keller saw a steamboat coming downstream and remarked to the people in the pilot house with him, "I wonder if that man is never going to blow the whistle. He's getting pretty close to home."
Keller made the remark to Clint Thomas, John B. Cook, Columbus Stewart and his wife, and another lady. Keller refused to name the other lady.
He continued, "When the other boat was within 450 or 500 yards of the Scioto, He blew the whistle twice to claim the Ohio side of the river. He immediately signaled his engineer to stop the engines and then reversed the boat to avoid collision.
So the unnamed lady in the wheelhouse was revealed to be one Mrs. Mary Hardin of Wheeling during the resumed testimony after lunch. So he did not want to share that at first, but I don't know if he was asked directly. Who was this? You have to tell us legally.
Sir, it's now more suspicious that you won't tell us her name.
So for whatever reason, he did not want them to know that initially. It does note that she's a Mrs., so I don't know. Maybe he's cavorting with a married lady, and they don't want people to know that. Maybe he's letting her steer the boat. Keller denied that alcohol played a role in the accident, saying that he had had only one drink back in Moundsville.
I do love that in theory is fine. Now I only had one drink back there. I'm good to go.
Well,
today, that would be fully unacceptable.
Well, this is kind of a sad tangent to go on, but it's like the Gaudreau brothers, the drunk driver that killed them. I believe he even said to the cop, "Oh, I had 6 or 7 beers." It's like, if that's what you're telling the cop you had, how much did you actually drink?
Right.
He said that, yes, he had this one drink back in Moundsville.
In response to further questioning by Eldridge G. Craycraft, Keller denied that he allowed Mary Hardin to handle the wheel of the boat or to blow the whistle. Keller testified that he attempted to take the Ohio side, despite the rules of navigation, because that was customary procedure for ascending boats at that point.
I'm imagining this all being one big confusion from Keller, bragging to his buddies about, it's oh yeah, I took old lady Hardin up in the pilot house. Yeah, let her steer the boat. Let her blow the whistle. Yeah. That was taken literally, and then now he's in so much more trouble than he would have been.
Yeah.
One of the main rules of navigation referred to here is that boats were to pass port to port unless some circumstance made it unsafe to do so. So a pretty normal that we would recognize now. This is the normal way to pass unless something would make it unsafe to do so, or if their positions were reversed. Let's say the Scioto is hugging the Ohio side and the Lomas is hugging the West Virginia. It doesn't make sense to cross the entire river just to do this type of pass.
It's kind of just like when you're both transiting past each other, essentially.
That's why the whistle system is there to say, okay, are we doing this the normal way, or should we just do it the way that, we are currently set up? The next person to testify was John B. Cook, who had been in the pilot house of the Scioto. He testified that Mary Hardin had not taken the wheel nor blown the whistle. He also said that Keller blew the whistle immediately after the Lomas had first signaled with theirs. That seems to conflict with other recollections that there had been some delay in response from the Scioto. That's a pretty common thing you hear, is that there was an inordinate amount of time before that response came. So, I'm already questioning Mr. Cook's testimony here. Also, what does immediate mean? This could be a subjective term. Other riverboat captains from the area were called into the hearing as well. Captain William Abrams of the Andes testified in support of Keller and the Scioto, saying that ascending the river on the Ohio side at this point was standard practice. So remember earlier we talked about how there was that conflicting web of federal and local regulations and how most of the time people didn't want to touch those local ones because it would piss people off. Another experienced captain, Hiram W. Smith, who'd been on board the Lomas during the collision, felt quite differently.
I heard the cross whistle, which alarmed me. I then went out of the cabin to see the ascending steamer. She was coming up in the position of an ascending boat, and we were going down in the same manner. We were in the channel. When the collision took place, the Scioto was pointing slightly to the Virginia shore. There was plenty of room between the Ohio shore and the Scioto for a towboat to pass. As a riverman, I can see nothing in the situation, nor no reason why the Scioto could not have responded in the proper manner to the first signal of the Lomas, and passed her accordingly. Further than that, if the whistle of the Lomas had been answered properly, the collision would not have taken place.
You have a bunch of testimonies on each side, each just supporting their, their story, their guy. To me, it seems like the Scioto wasn't totally paying attention, didn't respond in time, and once they did, they had this overloaded boat, and it's probably not going to be able to do the things you think it can do. Maybe you can make that turn, make that pass if it's under normal conditions, but they've already mentioned that this boat was hard to steer on the way down. So coming up, they probably are not as agile as they think they're going to be. Plus, you got Mary Harden cracking your here while you're trying to steer the boat. So, I mean, on a more serious note, we do know that there was not the sterile cockpit here because he doesn't deny that those people were in the wheelhouse.
No, this is very, very poor bridge resource management.
Yeah, he says, I didn't let her steer the boat. I didn't let her blow the whistle, but she was there. Benjamin Jackson Long, pilot on the Lomas, testified that he sighted the Scioto when she was about 1,600 yards downriver, hugging the West Virginia side. So again, Scioto is on the opposite side of the river from where she apparently wants to pass. He sounded his whistle at 800 yards to indicate he would pass on the Ohio side. This is the default based on both the law and just how the boats were situated. He got no immediate response, but the delayed 2 whistles caused him to attempt to reverse the Lomas and avoid a collision, which was, of course, not successful. So there's a bunch more testimony in this court of inquiry. It's just more of the same. Each side brings on supportive witnesses, and they attempt to impugn the quality of the other side's witnesses. The inspectors released their report on September 28th, including the decision to revoke David Keller's pilot license. So this is something they had the power to do. One of the more recent ways that their power was beefed up by the federal government.
Which that seems pretty reasonable, right? Like revoking his license, at least for some period of time.
They couldn't agree on revocation for Benjamin Long, so that decision was kicked up to Fehrenbach, who revoked his license. In February the following year, the Board of Supervising Inspectors of Steam Vessels reviewed these decisions. I think they're basically like a Supreme Court for any of these type things. They upheld the revocation of Keller's license, but overturned that of Benjamin Long, as he had been following the government-established rules at the time. So, of course, they're this federal board. It makes sense that they would want to support the guy who was following the rules as they were written. They don't want to encourage people to just go off and fall back on these traditional styles of navigation.
Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. Like, I don't feel like Benjamin Long did anything wrong inherently.
What's the point of writing these rules down if you're just going to be like, oh, well, but he's grandfathered in? Like,
right.
That's basically one of the witnesses' arguments in favor of Keller, saying, well, I've been navigating this river before there were any rules written down.
It's like, you're why we have rules.
You are why we need rules, sir. However, all those things aside, neither man's really out of the woods yet. If you remember back to the Moselle episode, I think we mentioned this, one of those new changes to the steamboat laws were that any steamboat accident resulting in a death could potentially lead to manslaughter charges for anyone deemed responsible, even via negligence. This didn't have to be something you actively did. It could be something that you didn't do. And so that opens several of these people up to potential charges of manslaughter. During a recess of the Court of Inquiry, the federal grand jury in Parkersburg returned manslaughter indictments for pilots and captains of both the Scioto and the John Lomas. From the time this law was instituted in 1838 up until our time here of 1882, there had only been 3 successful prosecutions for manslaughter under these circumstances.
That's wild that it was that low of a conviction rate. Like, those had to be such clear-cut cases.
Yeah, and I think especially using, like, at the time, I'm sure steamboat captains elicited probably a bit more sympathy than they might, looking back at it retrospectively. But yeah, like, this is a very rare thing to happen. And we saw how many times these steamboats exploded or collided with one another. And it's very rare to get anyone actually convicted. So after various clerical errors involving, they had to rewrite the indictment like 2 times. At least one time it was because they just listed the ship's name as the Lomas instead of the John Lomas. And so, like, as they're starting into the trial proceedings, they have to stop and throw it out and write a whole new indictment up because they messed up the name.
Isn't it crazy in some of the ways that Microsoft Office has changed the world?
Right.
That would be such a minor error today.
This delayed the trial for like a week because they had to rewrite this whole thing. Various errors here with the indictment. Keller's case finally went to trial in July 1883. A funny thing that came up here, again, they're talking with a bunch of, boat captains and things like this. During this trial, it's actually alleged that the Lomas had intentionally rammed the Scioto. That this was not an accident at all, but it was a case of mistaken identity. They said the Lomas mistook the Scioto for the steamboat Little Anna, who was her rival.
Like the Lomas was just out there hunting.
She thought this was this other boat, and so she tried to ram her, of course.
That's some wild stuff. Like, I feel like you're guilty if that's the defense you're bringing to the table.
I thought I was ramming this other steamboat. Or if you're the IDF, I thought I was shooting this other protester in the head.
Yeah, it's basically the same.
So no verdict could ultimately be reached, and the jury was discharged on August 10th. The case was retried in January of 1884. This time around, it seems very apparent that this judge, Judge Jackson, I believe, really did all he could to elicit a guilty verdict. He issued limits on what the local papers could print. So they couldn't print anything about the detailed proceedings of the trial. They could basically say, proceedings continued today in this case. And really no details. They couldn't, have any sort of editorializing on the case, which can judges do that? Can judges... do judges have that power?
I think in certain things they can, maybe. It may vary state to state, or maybe like a federal judge can. I don't know.
Like, I know they can limit like press access to the trial, but anyway. So this judge clearly wants a conviction here. He's lecturing the jury on how the law should be interpreted. All these things, he's very clearly trying to tip the scales. And ultimately, a guilty verdict was returned on February 14th. Not a happy Valentine's Day there. Along with a recommendation for mercy. So saying, yes, this guy's guilty, but we don't think he should be, punished super harshly.
I guess at this point, with it being like gone on for this long, like what else are you hoping to get out of him?
Yeah, it's like coming up on like a year and a half since it happened. On April 7th of 1884, Judge Jackson sentenced Keller to 2 years in the West Virginia Penitentiary.
Hey, back to Moundsville.
Which theoretically he had just taken a tour of not that long ago.
It's one of those things where he's like, didn't think I'd be seeing this again.
It looks different from the inside. He was also slapped with a $500 fine. So in 1884 money, that's a lot of money.
Especially when you're in the West Virginia Penitentiary.
Yeah. So on the same day that Keller was sentenced, Benjamin Jackson Long was arrested for complicity in the collision. Although it doesn't seem like Long was ever actually brought to trial.
It's just like one final embarrassment.
Or like an attempt at impartiality. I don't want to get tinfoil hat conspiratorial here, but I think the steamboat lobby had a lot to do with this, saying we need this guy who's trying to go with the local traditions. We need to put this guy in the slammer. We need to protect our boy, but you need to make it look like you're impartial. So at least, arrest him, go through the whole thing, but we don't need to actually charge him with anything. He's our boy. He's our soldier out there. He's following the rules.
Honestly, that makes way more sense than most conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's barely a conspiracy theory. I think it makes a lot of sense. Thaddeus Thomas, the captain of the Scioto, Levi Engelbright, captain of the John Lomas, neither of them were ever charged with anything here. So really, Keller is the only one who gets any punishment, and that kind of makes sense. I feel like he's the one who probably deserves it, if anyone.
Mm-hmm.
Keller's attorney led a campaign of gathering signatures to appeal to President Chester Arthur to pardon Keller. You don't really hear much about the Chester A. Arthur presidency, but...
No, that's a good one for forgetting that he was ever even a president.
One of several Civil War veterans to serve as president. Keller remained in prison until November 1885, when he was pardoned by the president, which is by this point Grover Cleveland in his first term.
I can live with that pardon.
However, Keller had served almost all of his sentence by this point. He only had a few months, especially given good behavior. He really only had a few more months left.
I suppose it helps like with your like record as far as
It does. And
like, a pride thing.
Especially because after this, after he gets out of prison, he returns home to Wheeling, he gets married, he gets his pilot license back. Maybe the pardon helps out with that. And he moves to Pittsburgh, where he works as a river pilot for the rest of his life. He dies sometime between 1910 and 1920. Bailey, I guess, wasn't able to find a date here. I wasn't able to find anything. He is recorded on the 1910 census, and then his wife is listed as a widow in 1920. So sometime in there.
Interesting.
Thaddeus Thomas died in 1919, and Levi Englebright in 1923. And I don't think there was anything mentioned about the ultimate fate of Benjamin Jackson Long. So that's kind of what happens with all of our boys from this episode.
Yeah, I imagine some of those vital records are a little hard to come by for some of these people.
So that's the story of the Scioto, and ultimately it's a story of, in a way, it's kind of progress versus tradition, where you have these points where those things butt heads, and it leads to these accidents, it leads to these deaths, because you kind of have two conflicting systems working at the same time. Mm-hmm. If not everyone is following the same set of rules, there's gonna be conflict like this. And yeah, this is relatively late in the age of, steamboat accidents that we would be discussing. Most of ours are earlier in the 1800s, but this was a really interesting one to see something that I don't think is super well known, probably outside of Wheeling, Steubenville area, if that. I mean, if you just Google steamboat Scioto, some of the local historical societies from the area come up. There's not really much there. Unfortunately, there was this very in-depth article from Kenneth Bailey. He does a lot with West Virginia history. So yeah, that was obviously a big help in making the episode. Yeah, that's what I've got for us here.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. It was interesting seeing a disaster like this that obviously had a ton of witnesses and still no one really knows what happened. Everything is he said. Whereas nowadays there would be recordings, there would be black boxes potentially, there'd be all kinds of things to help us parse out what happened here.
We would know exactly how much time went by between the first blast from the Lomas and the response from the Scioto. We would be able to know what was actually going on in that pilot house on the Scioto.
Who was, driving that ship?
Who was sucking and f***ing in the Scioto pilot house? In strict violation of federal statute.
Is not a sterile cockpit.
So yeah, I think that's what we've got this week. Next week, I don't know what we're doing.
I don't know yet.
We do have a fun upcoming guest episode. We'll have a fun guest who hasn't been on our show before, but I've been on his show several times, so it'll be a good time. So with that, I'll say take care, everyone, and we will talk to you again soon.